Welcome to Unlearning Out Loud. I'm Sid. This is our fifth episode, and today I'm joined by someone that I have admired from afar because you live far away from me for a really long time. I've admired you and your work and just like all the stuff that you've been able to do. This is my friend and colleague Omni. I'm going to toss it right over to them to introduce themselves and also give just a brief overview of their organization.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we have known of each other's work and worked together on things for so many years, and I think we still have not technically met in person, right?
No, we haven't.
Yeah, which is so wild. But yeah, I'm Omni. My pronouns are they and they. I'm the founder and CEO of the Sexual Violence Prevention Association. We're a national nonprofit dedicated to preventing sexual violence systemically. And so that looks like a lot of things, but primarily it looks like legislative advocacy, research, and then working on education, like broad public education, and changing cultural norms and institutions. So yeah, that's just like a brief overview of kind of who we are and what we're doing. And we've existed for a while. I've been in the space of prevention and sexual violence prevention for quite a long time, but the SVPA has existed for about 5 years.
That's so awesome. I remember when, like, I started explaining asterisk and was so new to, like, the prevention space. The SVPA was one of the first organizations to, like, validate me and, like, be willing to collaborate with me on things, but also just being so, like, really in awe of the stuff that you guys work on and, like, your branding. Everything you guys do is just so awesome and epic. I'm a big fan.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. No, I loved what you were doing with Explain the Asterisk, and it's rare that we get people so bold, willing to lead stuff and inspire others to do so. It's like so important to get that, especially in the campus space. So yeah, I remember we worked together on a few things related to Explain the Asterisk a ways back that were just so important.
Yeah. Well, I know you've already addressed like what preventing sexual violence on a systemic level looks like. Can you tell me just like a little bit more about what that means to work on something like on a systems level?
Yeah. So a lot of times when people think about sexual violence, or honestly even domestic violence, they think about it as a very individual action and something that should be addressed at the individual level. And we don't view it that way. We view sexual violence as the result of existing systems. And so there's like, a lot of different types of prevention. There's primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, but all of that kind of goes into primary prevention. Says, why do people even want to commit sexual violence? How can we prevent somebody from ever
Mm,
wanting to commit sexual violence? And that really ties in with rape culture, right? And how we see rape culture in media. We see it in so many different spaces. We see rape culture being very dominant and active as a form of culture, right? Like as a culture shifter almost. And because of that, people want to commit sexual violence because they have learned these behaviors, right? And they've been reinforced throughout society. But those are systems, right? Rape culture is a system. And so that can be
right.
addressed to make it so somebody doesn't want to perpetrate sexual violence in the first place. And then we also view a lot of other systems, right? Systems of harm, systems of oppression. Sexual violence is the result of power imbalances, and those power imbalances might be on the individual level. That's what most people think of them as, and they might be. That's like an adult perpetrating sexual violence against a child, or someone
Right.
who's a lot stronger physically than someone else perpetrating sexual violence against somebody who's weaker, or someone who's inebriated and not, right? Those levels of power imbalances, that is at the individual
Right.
level. But a lot of sexual violence is also at the institutional or systemic level. And so the institutional level is like a boss or a supervisor controlling their employee's career and their income, and then weaponizing that to basically force them to commit acts of sexual violence. And so that is, that's an institutional level of power and control that's coming from an institution, that's coming from a structure. And then the systemic level of power and control, that's where we get into sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism. And all of those things are very much also weaponized to commit sexual violence, right? We often see this with perpetrators. Like we'll see white cis men target black trans women. That's relatively common. We've seen that
Right.
repeatedly. And the reason is because white cis men know that they can get away with this. They know that the black trans woman's not going to get support or help or resources. And so that's, a level of power and control. And most sexual violence has all of these, right? It has individual, institutional, and systemic levels of power and control. But all of that is to say that we need to be addressing sexual violence through systems, right? We need to be addressing it at that systemic level. We need to be addressing everything from individuals and interpersonal interactions like parents and bystanders all the way up to institutions,
Right.
right? How are people being treated on college campuses, in K-12 schools, in companies, and then all the way up to that systemic level, right? How is it portrayed in media? What research and data do we have? And then what legislation do we have?
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I know it's so hard because we think about it on those different levels, primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of prevention, but to have it laid out like that is definitely helpful for me, even though I've been doing like systemic work for a long time. Um, I know when I first started out, when I went to college, I was going to be pre med. I was going to do genetics. And then after I went through my college sexual assault, everything, my grades tanked, pre-med bio, not for me, even before anything happened. But that's what led me to do social work, and in social work space, in my cohort and everything, I was the only person who was interested in doing like policy advocacy and more of that like macro social work, systems level work. And I don't think a lot of people think about policy when they're thinking about prevention or like preventing violence from happening. Yet, legislative advocacy is so central to your work and the work that like I was doing with Explain the Asterisk as well. So, in your perspective, how do you think that policy fits into prevention?
Yeah, absolutely. We feel so I feel that policy plays a big role and the SVPA operates from that lens as well. Which is that policy is very important because we talked about, individuals, interpersonal relationships, institutions, and then systemic like research, media, and legislation. Legislation affects all of those things, right? It affects
Mhm.
individuals, it affects interpersonal relationships. That's everything from we talked about primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Well, with primary prevention, right, how do we make it so that people don't want to commit sexual violence in the first place? That would require
Right.
things like massive PSAs, very broad campaigns across the country, education programs starting before high school, frankly. We just talked about this before we started, but elementary, like basically full K-12 prevention programming.
Right.
And that prevention programming isn't just don't touch people's private areas. Like, no, that's actually talking with
Right.
starting with the very basics of consent as a value, not in a sexual context, a fully just consent as a value in and of itself before the age of 12, right? All of those things require legislation. And that is
Mm.
legislative acts. And we see legislation these days sometimes help that and then also sometimes prevent that. We see a lot of legislation against sex ed, for example. And oftentimes the sort of
True.
education we're talking about gets lumped in with sex ed, even though it really shouldn't. Um, but yeah, so that primary prevention that needs legislation, and then secondary prevention, once somebody already has the values, beliefs, and attitudes or knowledge or lack thereof, leading to them wanting to commit sexual violence. How do we change that? Right? That might be things like teaching people about consent. Do people fully understand consent? A lot of people think, okay, as long as I'm not as bad as the first 5 minutes alone or SVU, I'm
Mhm.
not committing sexual
Yep.
violence, and that's not true. They are. So teaching consent, right? That also is often required by law. It's required by law under Title VII for all workplaces. It's required by Title IX for all colleges, although they keep weakening that, and for all
Mhm.
schools under Title IX. And so that secondary prevention, also legislation, right? And then tertiary prevention bridges that gap between prevention and response and says once harm's already happening, how do we stop it from continuing? Well, one of the things we've worked on is how do we get non-consensual deepfake pornography and revenge pornography? How do we get that stuff quickly removed? How do we get, legislation where these big mega tech companies have to quickly remove those
Mhm.
materials so that the harm doesn't keep continuing? That's also legislation. So I'm not saying everything has to be only legislation, but people don't realize that
Right.
legislation has the ability to impact everything from an individual's wants and what knowledge they have, what education they've received, what their values are, what's been allowed to be shown to them on TV, right? All of that stuff. It affects everything from an individual and a primary prevention up through secondary. Are they an active bystander? Have they been taught how to do how to understand consent? Have they gone through things, right? All of that can be affected by legislation. And that's everything from individuals to interpersonal to institutions, colleges, companies, K-12 schools, and then all the way up to media and all of that. And so really legislation is vital because it has the ability to affect all of those. I will also say we do also feel research is pretty vital. I think most people understand that one.
Yeah.
That research is very important because you can research any of those things to find out what's effective for prevention. My piece to add to that is policy is very similar, right? Anything
Yeah.
you can research, you could probably also pass a policy about it. And so that's really how we feel that policy ties in with advocacy and prevention broadly.
Yeah, and it ties in with what you were saying earlier of like what communities aren't being like included in research and how does that further inform the policies that are going to impact them. And I think with policy especially people don't always realize that policy is affecting them everywhere, whether it's the policies that they have at work, policies that are in place at the grocery store that they shop at, or, city, state, federal levels. Like it impacts pretty much every facet of our lives, whether we're thinking about it in that way or not. And a lot of the times, I think with policy, people don't realize how much it impacts them until those laws are changed, whether it's in a positive or a negative way. I know you mentioned a little bit about like that digital sexual violence piece of things. Could you say a little bit more about that? Like what that includes, what that looks like?
Absolutely. So, digital sexual violence to us is any form of sexual violence that is perpetrated on, the internet in the virtual space, and or any sexual violence that is enabled through technology that is like specifically like digital, related like technology. So, people often think of non-consensual deepfake pornography and revenge pornography. Those are not the preferred terms. Technically, the preferred terms is what we
Yeah.
say is non-consensual explicit materials NCEM, and those could be artificial explicit materials, so AI generated, or those could be authentic explicit materials, which would be like revenge pornography. But most everyday people don't know those terms, so I typically just say deepfake and revenge
Right.
pornography so that people know, what we're talking about. Um, but it also includes other things. It includes cyber stalking. It includes the fact that like cyber stalking is following people around on digital spaces and attempting to dox them. Doxing can also be a form of digital sexual
Mm,
violence. Not all doxing is sexual violence because it needs to be sexual in nature, but some is. And another thing people don't always think of is the use of location tracking is a form of digital sexual
mm,
violence. This is often pretty common in domestic violence situations with air tags and things like that added to people's cars. That's a form of digital sexual violence. Even though the main form of harm is actually happening in person between the two people, technology is
mm.
absolutely enabling that harm. And so we're seeing a lot of this skyrocket. AI is making it considerably worse and has
Right.
little to no guardrails or regulation on it.
Mhm.
So there's a lot within this. I mentioned a few types, but there are many, many more types, and unfortunately, more keep happening. That's going to keep happening at this point. Is different types of harm enabled through the internet are going to continue as technology advances and as it iterates upon itself. Right, the technology, right, AI keeps changing so rapidly in such a short period of time.
Yeah.
The digital sexual violence, once again, any form of sexual violence that's either perpetrated in an online or virtual space or using a digital or a virtual tool to cause harm.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that in a really digestible way. I know I'm seen with my friends, with at work, like I'm the biggest AI hater pretty much everywhere that I go because of how inundated in our lives it's become. You can't Google something without your first result being like an AI generated response and just like knowing how much harm that it's causing all of the time, whether it's environmentally or like two people's lives and the impact that that has on people. I could talk about it all day, but I go down like a doomy black hole about it. So I would rather spend time talking about maybe the things that are being done to address it. I know the Defiance Act is one of the big things that you guys at SVPA have been working on, which has been so incredible to see it like come to fruition because I know from working with you that it's been a long time coming, the Defiance Act. If you wouldn't mind telling us more about the Defiance Act, the Take It Down Act, and how this kind of addresses that digital sexual violence piece of things.
Yeah, so we've worked primarily on two big pieces of federal legislation. There's been a couple more here and there, but there's two big ones that we have worked on regarding digital sexual violence. And I would say that they're mostly regarding the most prolific form of digital sexual violence, which currently is the non-consensual sharing of explicit materials. So once again,
Right.
deepfake pornography and revenge pornography. So once again, deepfakes is AI generated. Revenge is when they're authentically created real images, often taken with consent, but then shared without consent. Both of
Right.
those are very prolific, and they're so the fastest increasing forms of digital sexual violence that we're seeing. And so we've worked on two pieces of legislation. The Take It Down Act was signed into law a year ago, in May of 2025. And the Take It Down Act had two pieces. One was it did criminalize deepfakes. I think specific no, it criminalized deepfakes and revenge. I think it criminalized both. We are not super in favor of criminalization, so that part of the bill we were
Yeah.
very heavily involved in. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, a
It's a
little
hard
later.
balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, of, like,
Um,
not wanting to further criminalize things, but wanting there to be some form of, like, policy and accountability. It's a tough balance.
yeah, it's a hard balance, and we don't feel like decriminalization is the best solution for this issue.
Yeah.
But the way that it was written was like, okay, it's not overreaching too much. It's not increasing,
Yeah.
harm, but it's also that we wanted, the other piece of it, because there was two big pieces of the Take It Down Act, and the other piece that we were much more involved in and that, we are already seeing an impact from, was this requirement. It basically regulates big tech companies, requiring all social media companies, search engines, and all other digital platforms, any online platform, including apps, all of that. It requires them to create a report and remove procedure. So basically, this is a procedure to where a victim can say, "This is an image of me. This is an explicit image of me, whether it was AI generated or not." They can say, "This is an explicit AI generated image of me," or "This is a real image I shared with somebody. It seems like they posted it online." Either way, they can report that, and the platform has to remove it within 48 hours. And if they fail to remove it, then the victim can report them to the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, and then the FTC can take action against that company for failing to comply with the regulation. That might be monetary, that might be, cease and desist. There might be a lot of things that happen that the FTC can
Um,
enforce from them, depending on the severity of the case and if this is repeated action by that company or whatever the case may be. But the FTC chooses that punishment basically. And so that was the really big piece was we wanted some carve out from Section 230, which basically says that companies aren't responsible for anything anybody posts on their platforms. We wanted a carve out for that. We
Crazy.
wanted regulations and to get regulations against big tech in this day and age, especially something led by a Republican that was led by Ted Cruz. That's just so rare.
Mm.
So that was really big. We were very active in that advocacy, and as I said, it passed a year ago. So that implementation date for the report and remove procedure actually just happened in May. So now all tech
Awesome.
platforms have a way for people to report this is deepfake of me. It needs to be removed, and then the platform has 48 hours, which is just super super important. Um, but this is all very focused on the tech companies, and then criminalization, of course, focuses on the perpetrators,
Right.
focused on the victims. And so victims still don't have a way to sue, right, in civil court. Victims don't have a way to bring a lawsuit themselves. For those who don't
Right.
know, criminal cases are brought by the government. It's saying you broke our laws, you broke our rules, the government's rules, thus we are going to hold you accountable. That typically is where that looks like jail, often, sometimes fines, but often maybe imprisonment, community service, jail, etc. Whereas civil cases is when a victim says, I was harmed. I want remedies for that harm. Typically, this is in the form of financial compensation, but it can be other things as well. I want remedies for that harm, and it's very focused on the victim and what was taken from them, or how the harm that was caused affected them, and how to rectify that harm. It's the closest our current legal system gets to restorative justice. Very
Mm.
imperfect, though. I want to be super clear about that. Just the closest you can get right now in the current legal system in the United States. And so the Defiance Act does exactly that. The Defiance Act creates a civil right of action so that victims can sue in civil court any perpetrators who created, shared, distributed, or solicited, so requested, non consensual deepfake pornography. And so it goes a little bit further, whereas the Take It Down Act is only covering publishing. It's only covering things that are published
Right.
publicly. But a lot of these images, when people are sharing them, they're sending them to people's boss or to their partner or to their parents or just to the person, and then
Right.
pressuring them to give them money or something in order for them not to post it publicly. But yeah, a lot of them aren't immediately posted publicly. So we made sure to cover all of those things, including, of course, posting it publicly, but also everything else. And so victims can sue perpetrators in civil court. And that's what the Defiance Act does. That's what it will do. That has not yet passed. It's passed the Senate unanimously twice. It passed the Senate unanimously
Yeah.
most recently in January of this year. And now it's in the House of Representatives. And you may have seen Paris Hilton has been a very, very big
Yes.
advocate of it. She's spoken on it on late night shows. She's done a whole TikTok series on it. And she came with us to the Capitol with our two primaries on our bill, AOC and Laurel Lee, to also have a press conference speaking about this bill and how important it is. And that's just been so, so helpful. So we're really hoping it'll get across the finish line in the House in the next couple of months.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I had so much FOMO. I was, like, crying. Not crying because I was sad I had FOMO, but I was just, like, so happy to have, because there's so much policy work. I think a lot of people don't understand how much time it takes to make movement in those spaces. I know when I started explaining the asterisk, I had this misconception. I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna email someone about an idea for a bill, and it's gonna be, like, wrapped up within the next year." Luckily, I was a freshman in college, so I had more time than that because it took so long to even make, like, okay, we introduced it this session and it made its way out of judiciary and then it died. And then, it made it to this committee and then it fell asleep there and nothing happened, or it finally passed the House and it didn't pass the Senate. Like, it's such a process, and things can be kind of idling for a long time, and then all of a sudden a bill is going to be up and it's like go, go, go time. So it's just, that's something I think I want to name for people, is that it is so much behind the scenes work, like constantly advocating for things, kind of like sitting and waiting once something is written and it's introduced, just like waiting for that movement, because there are so many bills and in different committees and in general in Congress and the Senate that need to be looked at, but it can be like a painfully slow process sometimes. So I was just so happy to see all the coverage that y'all were able to get for this, and seeing like Paris Hilton post on TikTok about it and talk about it on those late night shows. I was like, oh, I was just thinking of you and like your team and how much work you guys have put into it and how absolutely like amazing it is and how important it will be when it passes for survivors.
Yeah, it'll be super important. It does take forever. Legislation takes a very, very long time.
Mhm.
And it's so confusing because one bill can take like 2 years to pass, another bill can take like 12. We have a Massachusetts bill that like,
Yeah.
I've been involved in I've been
Is it the
involved in,
Healthy Youth Act?
yeah, I've been involved in that for what, 6 years, but it's been going for what, 12 years? Maybe more.
Yeah, I think it is 12.
And so it's like, it's so hard. And like the Defiance Act, for example, passed the Senate unanimously last Congress as well. And then just didn't pass
Yeah,
the House, and there wasn't a reason. It wasn't that we had people that were, like, against it or anything. No, it was just simply that
right.
they had a lot of other things they were working on, and it's hard to get through and get things prioritized, and so hopefully in this session, it'll be a little bit different, but also it's a bit of a intense time in Congress right now, so we'll see.
Yeah, it always is. It's tough. I know when I was working on the transcript notation legislation on the federal level, it was like, okay, it was going to be called the Safe Transfer Act. It had been like introduced differently before I had gotten involved. We were ready to introduce it, and then COVID happened, and obviously
And
everything else kind of got put on the back burner. It's like things that are so out of your control. And again, like you said, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have enough support and it wouldn't pass. A lot of the times it's just all these other extenuating circumstances that it doesn't get its time to shine.
yeah, exactly, and it's also we have to be very political in how we go about this, like, we do endless meetings um representatives to be like, "This is a priority, we need you to make it a priority." And it's just making it a
Yeah,
priority and then fighting for it to continue to be a priority, and then making sure that when big things that do just randomly come up, right, like government shutdowns and stuff happen,
right,
that it's like a priority once those things are over, that people don't forget it, that you're not losing that momentum. It's definitely a lot
right.
of work, but
It's that constant presence that you don't think about behind the scenes of, oh, well, if you introduce a bill and it's like sitting and waiting for 2 years, then isn't it an easy job to have? But like you said, you have to be that constant like voice and presence of like "Hey, I know these are bills that are up on your docket, like, this week," or, "I know this came up," but just that constant voice in the back of their head of like, "Oh, I need you to have this as a priority, survivors need you to have it as a priority," and just being that kind of thorn in their side about things. It's important stuff.
Yeah. No, 100%.
Now, I know we talked a lot about the kind of federal priorities that y'all have been working on. Are there any state bills that you guys have been working on that you would like to talk about? I know you guys do work in lots of different states with different kind of political landscapes there. So, anything specifically that you would want to talk about on more of a state level of thing?
Yeah, we have recently had a few wins related to our state sexual violence framework and our campaign around that. So that's a new framework that we just released about a month ago that talks about how the government itself commits sexual violence against people, either
Mm,
commits it directly or tolerates it. And so there's like two types of state sexual violence: one is state sanctioned and one is state tolerated. And state sanctioned is things like strip and cavity searches, pat downs at TSA. It's the fact that for in a lot of immigration facilities, for example, there's cameras on all the time, recording when people are
right,
changing, recording when people are, just showering and all of that stuff. Those are all forms of state sexual violence. They're once again sexual in nature. They're going against people's consent. And in any other context, if they weren't legally permitted and normalized, they would absolutely be considered sexual violence, and they should be.
right.
So that's state sanctioned sexual violence, and state tolerated sexual violence is things like um, for example, sexual violence in the military being incredibly rampant, but often being ignored, right?
Yeah.
Perpetrators are often still promoted, or with we see this with police a lot. They'll actually just be
Mhm.
quietly put to a different location. And you actually have
Right,
brought this up quite a lot. Explain the asterisk kind of discusses this, right? Because
right,
state tolerated is talking about how the government does this, but explain the asterisk talks a lot about how colleges do the same thing, where people, have an asterisk about why they're leaving their other school, but instead of looking at that,
right,
people just don't look at that and allow a perpetrator to enter their institution. And so the government itself does
right.
this a lot, and that's state tolerated. We often see this in the military and police, etc., when they're tolerating that sexual violence is happening. And so state sexual violence is very rampant, and I think definitely increasing under the current administration. And so we have had some state wins about this recently. We've had wins in Montana, Colorado, and Idaho most recently. In Montana, we were able to get a bill vetoed that would have significantly increased the amount of strip searches. It basically was
That's
saying that
awesome.
anybody held for 12 hours, just held, they don't need to be charged, they don't need to have a court
Mm,
order, nothing, just held, could be searched, and they did not need to use a reasonable suspicion standard. They were lowering the legal standard. So not only was it anybody held, but it was saying that they did not need to meet a legal requirement of, okay, we have reason to believe, right, that this person has contraband of some kind. They didn't need to meet that requirement. And we were able to get that vetoed, which was good. This would have really, really increased the amount of strip searches. So getting that
yeah.
vetoed meant that, a lot of people are not going to be strip searched who would have been. And then Colorado is kind of the opposite of that. Colorado
Mhm.
had a relatively famous case where a jail commissioner was viewing the um the body cam footage of strip searches. Body cams would often be on during strip searches, and he was viewing these recordings for not for professional reasons, for his own sexual gratification. He viewed them over 3,000 times, over 100 different videos of
Oh,
100 different women who were incarcerated at his jail where he was commissioner. And now, luckily, this has come to light and they are suing and they're doing really amazing stuff. But also the fact that he had access
awesome.
to this, the fact that technically
Right.
there were no kind of parameters around this, there really shouldn't be body camera footage of these strip searches. And so we worked with the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault. They did such amazing work. And we worked with them on preventing sexual abuse in jails, a bill to both prevent some forms of strip searching, so to really minimize the amount of strip searches, to make it so that they have to meet a higher legal standard, like the opposite, right, of what I mentioned with Montana. They have to meet a
Right.
higher standard of, we have reason to believe that this person has, contraband on them, and that two independent officers have to meet that, and then also increasing the protections under PREA, which is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, just
Mhm.
strengthening those protections and making it so that not only will the state sanction sexual violence of strip searching be lessened, but also the state tolerated sexual violence, because often during strip searches, harassment will take place, that will also be
Right.
lessened because of these protections. And so that was a really big monumental bill. We hope that that is like, we're planning to use that in our existing. We have a boilerplate legislation that we plan to introduce in a few different states next year,
Awesome.
beginning of 2027. We're really hoping that this is the start of a bigger campaign to stop strip searches, and really get that to be addressed broadly, because it's just such a prolific form of state sexual violence that people don't even think about. It's often overlooked. And then the Idaho bill, very similarly, was not only about strip searches; it was much more broad, but it basically expanded the definition of sexual misconduct. The definition was quite narrow
Okay.
before, very, very narrow before. I'm not going to get explicit, but people can look up what it was before and what it is now. And then also, a lot of times, the defense when staff and guards would commit sexual violence against prisoners was that, oh, well, it was consensual. And so now this makes it so that that can no longer be consensual. They cannot make that argument. There's too big of a power imbalance for anybody who is in
Right.
prison to be consenting to a sexual act with somebody who is a staff member or a guard. And so that was really big. And then that also strengthened the protections under the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And so those were really the three most recent state bill wins that we've had, all regarding state sexual violence. We're hoping to see a much bigger effort with the Stop Strip Searches campaign, with our boilerplate legislation in a few different states. And then eventually we're hoping to see some federal movement. We would really
Yeah.
love to address the way that strip searches are used in immigration detention facilities right now. But there's no way in this current Congress we would be able to get a bill that would be
Yeah.
politically viable. But we've done a few other things related to that, with like defunding them or not allowing them to get funding, and advocating for them to not have any additional funding for ICE and for these facilities just in general, and especially not considering all of the rampant sexual violence that's happening. But yeah, eventually that is something we plan to take this and expand it to that.
Yeah, that's so amazing. Like I said so many times before, y'all do such amazing work and have such amazing like partnerships and different like community partners in different areas and different states. And I'm looking forward to seeing like how you're able to take that framework you were talking about, I think from Colorado, and then be able to apply that either on different like state levels or on that federal level, which we know federal level, it's all about like political landscape and knowing what's not to say worth the effort, but knowing kind of the different angles to play and, if I know it's not gonna be politically viable at this level right now, like, what other angles can we take? What other things can we work on to make, like, smaller movements towards the same goal?
Yeah, exactly. And oftentimes right now that's looking like state legislation.
Yeah.
And luckily we've had some great luck, and some governors have been very involved. And yeah, in general, anybody who's losing hope in the federal government, I understand why, but definitely be looking at what your governor is doing or your local state government is doing, because we have had such amazing advocacy, like really, really interesting advocacy coming out at the state and governor level. Like governors specifically have been much more active than they ever have. We're currently working with some governors on a letter regarding ICE and potentially investigations. Also state attorney generals, I should say. So we've been working with some state attorney generals as well, or I should say attorneys general, I believe is actually the correct plural of that word. But like there's been some really good like state level advocacy and investigations and stuff, into not just holding the institutions within that state accountable, but also holding the federal government accountable, which is so important.
Especially, like you said, these times, I think even for myself, I definitely fall into that hole of like everything sucks, everything is awful. On the federal level, it's like can't go on the internet because I will just doom scroll about the state of our federal government. But it's such a good perspective to have because there is such good work happening on the state levels and city levels as well, like talking about, different city councils and towns that are able to do local legislation to help protect people in different ways too. It's such an important thing to shed light on, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Yeah. Now I know we kind of talked about it a little bit and it's come up in different sectors, but part of the work that you guys do that I absolutely adore because you don't see it happening in many prevention spaces is the abolition work that you guys do. Now, I want to start, I think, by just saying and acknowledging that a lot of the times when people are having discussions about abolition, interpersonal violence, whether it's domestic violence, sexual violence, is almost always used as the reason why we can't have abolition. What are your thoughts, feelings, concerns on that? Because I know, at least for me, that's something, being someone who works in the prevention space, that's always brought up. Like, oh, you can't, what are you going to do if, so and so is physically abusing their partner? Who are you going to call? You're going to call the police. You can't have abolition when things like this are happening. So I'm curious what your thoughts are and how you, as an organization, were able to move towards doing this work.
Yeah, that is absolutely the predominant thing that we hear as well of like, "Oh, we can't abolish the police. We can't reform the criminal legal system. We need these systems." But they're not working. So, if
Right.
they were working, I'd maybe hear people out, but they're just really not. You can talk to pretty much any survivor, they're not working. People are not getting help.
Right.
So, the at the end of the day, retributive justice, which is like the current criminal legal system in the United States, basically just says like, who the question really is who broke our laws, right? And then how do we
Mm,
punish the whoever broke our laws? Um,
right.
but like that's not focused on that's not focused on who caused harm. That's focused on who broke our laws, right? Who broke our rules.
Mhm.
And then also it's not focused on once again restoring that harm or preventing it from happening again. No, it's just okay, let's punish them for doing that. And there's this
Right.
like mentality that if we punish people for doing things that will prevent them from other people from doing them, from making an example. There's a lot of evidence showing that that's not true. And there's been evidence showing that for like a really long time. I mean, the Pavlov guy with the dogs, that people quote that all the time, but, like, the more not that that was great research, I don't support people researching on dogs, so it's not okay. But, like, we've known for a very long time that, like, negative reinforcement, which is when you negative like, you add something because somebody did something you didn't like, so you add harm to them because they did something you
Right.
like them to do, that's not nearly as effective as positive reinforcement, meaning you help them do the right thing and you reward them for doing so. And, like, there's a lot more to be said about that, but the current legal system is absolutely not, set up for any of those things. And so once again, the question right now is for the legal system is who broke our rules and then how do we punish them for having done so?
Right.
And then restorative justice really says, okay, well, who was hurt and how do we help them heal? Right? How do we restore what happened?
Right.
And so that's taking a much more survivor centered approach, and that's why a lot of you see a lot of survivor groups advocate now for restorative justice because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
we need survivor centered things, and then transformative justice like came out of restorative justice and was during the civil rights movement. For anybody who doesn't know, retributive justice came from European colonizers. Restorative justice came from Native and Indigenous peoples, and then transformative justice came out of the civil rights movement, and it was building upon restorative justice. And that says what systems allowed this to happen, right? What of our current systems, what of our
Mhm.
current society allowed this to happen? How did our current systems encourage this or allow it? And then what can we do to prevent it in the future? And that is, we view that all the best solution is always restorative and transformative justice used together. First should always be restorative justice. Let's restore the harm that was caused. And then second is, okay, let's take a second look at the systems. How do we prevent this from happening again? Not just from this one person, this one perpetrator, but from the system itself.
Right.
And so those things are very, very important. I think part of the reason that people are very against this is a few things. One, genuinely, and we could have a whole podcast about this, Law and Order SVU is one of the best things that happened to the sexual violence prevention movement and the sexual violence movement more broadly. And it's also one of the worst things that has ever happened. Law and Order
Agreed.
SVU
Agreed.
really made the general public understand that sexual violence is very pervasive. There's many different types. Consent can look like a lot of different things. It has immense impacts, and it's often somebody that the person knows. It really helped with a lot of misnomers and making it very clear that this needs to be addressed, right? That this is harm. But at the same time of presenting people with that problem and making people face it, which was good. We needed people to do that. It actually also presented a solution that there's people like Olivia Benson
Right.
in jail and police stations dedicated to working on this, who are survivor centered, who are survivors themselves, who are trauma
Right.
informed. And Mariska Hargitay herself is absolutely that, but most actual cops are
Yeah.
not that.
She is.
Most actual cops are
Yeah.
not actually doing that. And so I think that it once again, did really amazing things for the field, but I also think that it kind of presented the criminal legal system as a bit more effective than it currently is, to say the very least. So yeah, I feel that there's a lot that people don't understand about restorative transformative justice, and then I also feel that when people say things like, "Well, what are you going to do when X Y Z happens?" Right? It's always either
Mhm.
what do when sexual violence happens or domestic violence happens. That's because they're not viewing the fact that there's a lot of other options, right? We're not saying let's abolish that
Right.
and have absolutely nothing. And nor are we saying
Right.
just reform it, right? We're saying that no, we need a truly entirely different system. And what does that look like? In an ideal society, that would also look like abolishing rape culture, or at the very least,
Mhm.
really heavily addressing it. And so I think that that's super important. So in general, we do hear that a lot from people, but one of the main things we come back to is one, the current system's not working. It's just not. Most people never report because they don't even think it'll work. I mean,
Mhm.
people who do report hardly ever, is if we define success as punishing if we define success the way they define success,
Right.
which I don't. I don't define success as you broke the law. How do we punish you because you broke the law? I don't.
Mhm.
My morals don't line with our laws. They sometimes do, but often don't.
Yeah.
Um, so, like, I don't agree with that, but even if I do, just to be nice, let's just say for just a second, I agree that sure, punishing the perpetrator, even imprisoning them, let's say we agree that that's the end goal. You're not doing that. They're not doing that. Show
Right.
me when they've done
That's
that.
so true.
They've done that maybe 5 times. Maybe 5 times have they actually done that. They're not doing it. And then also, I don't really want them in jail with a bunch of other people, some of whom, like, are often quite young. People don't realize this. There's a lot of very
Yeah.
young people in prisons and jails. Now this person that y'all say is a rapist, like by their own mentality, I'm like, how is that preventing sexual violence? You're just preventing it from the general
Mhm.
population because y'all don't view incarcerated people as human beings who are also require safety and protection. So all of that is to say
Right.
that it's not successful, it's not working. We need to be envisioning other options. And there's been some great work on restorative and transformative justice for sexual violence specifically. And that's been really big in a few different places. There's a few different people and folks working on that. We've also done the Survivors for Abolition kind of campaign on our social medias. If people look for that
Yeah.
hashtag, you can see survivors sharing their own experiences with police or experiences with the criminal legal system or their experiences and beliefs about abolishing the police or restorative justice or transformative justice or anything like that. But yeah, it's definitely a big thing in this field, a big currently debated conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so interesting having any of those conversations, whether it's with someone else in the field or someone in an adjacent field or just some random person off the street, like they seem to have this idea that when we're talking about abolition, that it's like enough people agree to try it, and then it's like tomorrow all the police officers in the legal system they're gone. Like when we know that's not how anything happens. So I guess I'm kind of wondering like what do you think even if that's, like, still our end goal, which I think it should be, what can we try to do, like, in the meantime? What even if, people are on board, what would that, like, in between kind of look like?
Absolutely. It honestly comes down to very similar things for anybody who is um actually like certified as like a rape crisis counselor. If anyone's done that, I'm sure a good amount of your listeners have. I think you might have. One of the biggest things discussed is always to give survivors options, right? Sexual
Mhm.
violence. So giving people more options is so important. Right now, what we advocate for is providing restorative and transformative justice options in addition to the current criminal legal
Right.
system. Making sure that people have options available to them. And that's what we mean when we say we are very in favor of civil, civil liability. So basically
Right.
giving survivors the right of action, right? It's a civil right of action, civil liability, same thing. It's to sue in civil court because that's a survivor centered approach, right? The survivor themselves has to sue.
Right.
Nobody else can sue on their behalf. It's not a criminal case where the district attorney decides whether or not to move forward. The survivor
Mhm.
themselves decide if they want to move forward with those cases. But also truly having restorative and transformative justice options in place as like a do you wish to go through this process? Part of the issue with restorative and transformative justice options, like I just said, though, is it does require buy-in from the community. You can't really force
Right.
a perpetrator to enter a restorative justice option, at
Right.
least not in good faith, and you're likely not to have a very strong outcome if they're not entering it in good faith. And honestly, a lot of that comes down to what does community look like. Different communities do have restorative and transformative justice options, and I think that that's where we start is having those options on a community level, because communities that buy into that, then the members of the community will have investment in it, and then when sexual
Right.
violence happens, they can move forward with it through that community who is, dedicated to restorative and transformative justice and has a norm already set, right, and an expectation already set to do so.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think it's important to think about that, like, in between. And I was thinking when you were talking about when Tracy DiTomasi from Callisto was on the podcast and we were talking about accountability and what that can look like. And she was talking similar to you of like, it's really all about what the survivor wants. Like, that's what being survivor centered means. So if you have, three different survivors, different situations, one of them, their idea of accountability might be right now, I want that person to go to jail and throw away the key. One person might say, I just want them to admit that they harmed me. And one person might not want anything to do with anything. And it's all about what they want. So I was thinking about that while you were talking, just because there are so many different ideas of what that looks like and what it means to be survivor centered is it's up to that person and what they want. And I think for a very long time, especially doing expand the asterisk work where I would talk to different survivors. And the thing I think I would hear the most would be, I just don't want this person to go and do this to someone else, which I think is extremely common. And I think that fits so nicely in with, hey, let's do the transformative restorative justice. Let's have a conversation. Maybe that looks like I want you to admit that you caused harm to me. I want you to admit what you did. But sometimes, I mean, we know that consent education is extremely lacking. Lots of people don't have a conversation about consent until they get to high school or even college if they go to college. So a lot of the times it's just needing a safe space to have those conversations. And again, in a safe way.
Yeah. And if I can, you mentioned that most survivors, and I
Mhm.
hear the same thing, most survivors say,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure this person isn't it basically says like that they caused me harm and that they understand that and that they're
Yeah.
not gonna do it again, right? That they understand that
Right.
this was harmful. The criminal legal system incentivizes the exact opposite. It basically
Exactly.
tells perpetrators, fight forever that you never did anything.
Mhm.
Get a lawyer to
Right.
also fight forever that you never did anything, you didn't cause harm. Like, and that I think
Right.
is part of the reason that it needs full reform, like not just like reform, but like
Right.
full abolition and
Take it
land
out
use
with the
systems.
roots included.
Exactly. And so, yeah, but that because that's one of the most common things that I hear, and yet with the criminal legal system as is, that is just not. It's literally
Right.
discouraged. It's the opposite of what the current system is set up to do.
Right, and a lot of the times too, like, whether it's in conversations about abolition or just people talking about even with the stuff with Epstein or any times it comes out that someone who has a lot of power or is famous has caused harm in some way, people are like, "Oh, lock them away, throw away the key. I want them to go to prison. I want them to be sexually assaulted in prison." It's like, okay, so actually, like, being sexually assaulted in prison is not part of the punishment. It shouldn't be. And people who I've talked to and have seen, like, online, people are like, "Well, no, that's part of the punishment, that's part of what you get when you go to jail. If you go to jail and you get sexually assaulted in jail, then you deserve it, you were in jail." And it's crazy to me because we know the statistics of how many people are harmed while they are incarcerated. Well, and I think the majority, it's like 60 something percent is from staff of the correctional facility like you were talking about earlier. I could go on it's a circle. I could go on about it forever.
Yeah, exactly. It is a circle. It just keeps going. And that's the criminal legal system is increasing. both forms of power and control, right? Which we talked about. Sexual violence is a result of
Right.
the exploitation of existing systems of power and control. So it's just creating more of them. It's creating hierarchies. It's creating all of that, and not only that, it's creating systemic oppression, right? Because we see mostly
Right.
people of color, mostly Black people,
Mhm.
specifically Black and Native people in this country, and being incarcerated, and so it's just perpetuating systemic oppression, and systemic oppression leads to sexual violence. And so it's
Right.
us, it's not, it can't be prevention because systemically it's encouraging all of the systems that lead to sexual violence, including the
Mhm.
sexual violence that happens in the prisons themselves. So, there's a lot. It's all a big system, and I think it can get overwhelming to think about abolition. And I think that's why some people just kind of shut it down outright. And I also think
Yeah.
it's comforting to think that the current system works, or could work. I think that's
Yeah.
comforting to be able to be like, "No, no, no, it's a solution simple." And I think it's a lot harder to be like, "Okay, no, this current system's not working. We need to get creative. We need to get better systems." That's a harder thing to think through. It's more complex.
Absolutely. I know we're coming towards the end of our time, but I had one other thing I wanted to talk to you about before we close. The SVPA recently released a new report called Sorvo, the Anti-Trans Entities and Trans Plus People. Can you explain what that is for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sorvo is a framework that we created that explains how oppressive groups use accusations of sexual violence in order to justify their oppression. And so
Mm.
this most recent report that we put out, talks about how trans people are often accused by right wing politicians, transphobic political pundits,
Yeah.
right wing influencers, all of that are often, trans people are often accused by those people of being pedophiles and groomers and of committing massive
Mhm.
amounts of sexual violence, right? And then those claims that LGBT plus people are committing mass sexual violence, specifically trans people are committing mass sexual violence, those claims are then used to justify bathroom bans, sports bans, healthcare bans,
Mm.
etc. Right? They're using those
Yeah.
accusations to justify, right, this harm. And this is not just with trans people. We've seen this historically with during Jim Crow in the United States. So our first report actually had 4 historic case studies, and it talked about how this exact same framework was used during Jim Crow in the United States, where white supremacists accused Black people, specifically Black men, of committing massive amounts of sexual violence, and then used that as an excuse for Jim Crow segregation policies. And we know that that wasn't true because once again, in all of these cases, they're reversing the victim and offender. We know trans people experience very high
Right.
rates of sexual violence. Black people experience very high rates of sexual violence. And so they're reversing the victim and offender, in order to justify, right, their systemic oppression. And that's what the acronym stands for, is systemic oppression, reverse victim and offender. It's similar to DARVO, but DARVO is very much responsive, right? DARVO is once somebody is accused of causing harm, they're right denying, attacking, and reversing victim and offender. SORVO is preemptive and it's very calculated, and we have 8 pillars within it. It's done by governments or regimes, typically by governments or regimes, in order to commit mass atrocities, right? Like genocide and things. And so the first report came out, and talked about once again how during Jim Crow, white supremacists denied, omitted, erased, and defined sexual violence committed against Black people. It wasn't considered sexual violence under the law, and they didn't
Right.
allow it in statistics, and they just denied it outright if ever accused it. But meanwhile, they fully falsified, just fully made up or sensationalized, or redefined sexual violence committed by Black people against white people, right? And so this is, we see Emmett Till, for example, where a white woman claims that Emmett Till whistled at her, and then later admitted that that was not true, right? So we've seen this. The first report talks like that came out, I want to say 2 years ago, and that talked about it in relation to Jim Crow, South African apartheid, the Holocaust, and LGBTQ plus people, historically. And then we put out a follow report about the use of Sorbo, currently and present day by the United States and Israel and Zionist entities to justify the ongoing genocide in Palestine. And then the most recent one
Mhm.
that you put out, and this most recent one was with Forge Forward, a great organization, really love them, trans-led, org for trans survivors and gender expansive survivors and folks. And this was about how it's currently being used in the United States against trans people, right? Sort of that these accusations are being used.
Yeah, that's just important work that I think I don't see, like, as much in my spaces as much as I think it should be. Um, kind of thinking along that line, how does the work that y'all do on Sorvo intersect with the other work that you're doing, on state sexual violence and also that policy advocacy piece as well?
Yeah, a lot of Servo ends up being state sexual violence, and at the end of the day, it's often
Yeah.
committed by governments. And also it's like a lot of things. So for trans people, for example, there's things now with these healthcare bans and genital checks
Mhm.
in order to play sports, where that is effectively the government committing state sexual violence against people
Right.
and claiming that them committing that state sexual violence is necessary. They must do that because otherwise trans people are going to commit sexual violence against other people, right? And that's just very clearly Sorvo. It's tying together Sorvo and state sexual violence. It's tying together all these things. And a lot of this is because at the end of the day, the government is using sexual violence and the fact that so many people are like, that it's so intense and most people are, of course, against it.
Right.
They're using that and weaponizing it to get people to feel unsafe and to justify mass amounts of oppression and mass amounts of sexual violence. And that's how we get people, like what you said before, being okay with some people being sexually assaulted because they deserve it, right?
Right.
Whereas I feel that nobody
Right.
deserves it. Even people who have committed sexual violence do not deserve sexual violence. That should never be part of the punishment.
Right.
And so anyways, it ties in with a lot of that. And then with legislative advocacy, it's really looking mostly like us advocating against when Sorvo is used in policies, right? So the Lincoln
Mm.
Riley Act, for example, that is an example of Sorvo in action.
Yeah.
We see this with Trump all the time, with immigration especially, and trans people as well, but often with immigration. They're tweeting out and putting on Instagram and everywhere, right, images
Mhm.
of immigrants and saying, "Oh, this person was a child molester, and that's why we have to do all the stuff we're doing,"
Yeah.
even though they've had several lawsuits and been forced to take down several, which were entirely fabricated, entirely false. They are fully
Right.
just
But the damage is
falsifying.
done. Right.
Falsely accusing immigrants of committing sexual violence, putting their faces up and saying this person's a rapist, and they're not. And so it's often us when that turns into policy, which it often does. So things like the Save Women Act, and it's really just a bill to add more funding to ICE, saying we have to save women from
Mhm.
immigrants, right? It's us saying that's not true. That's not true. If you actually want to prevent sexual violence against women, like you're claiming in the title of this bill,
Right.
that's not the way to do it. You're using that as an excuse. And meanwhile, you're defunding all of the domestic violence and sexual violence programs,
Right.
and you're blacklisting a bunch of these orgs, and you're strong arming them to stop serving immigrants and trans people. You don't actually want to serve, sexual violence. You only talk about it when it's convenient to better oppress immigrants and trans people. So all of that is to say, a lot of it is it shows up a lot. Sorgos often shows up in the name of bills and in the arguing in
Mm.
favor of bills, and they'll talk a lot about the sexual violence piece and the sensationalization of it, without people realizing what's actually in the bill is basically
Right.
authoritarianism, and they're justifying that authoritarianism by making people feel scared and making people feel that these folks are coming to commit mass amounts of sexual violence, which is just not true.
Right, and it's so intentional the way that they, like, name things to sound like it's something that would be really awesome, like, "Of course we wanna save women, we love women," but then you read the context of the bill and you're like, "Okay, that's actually not what this is about at all," and I think this kind of ties into one of my last couple questions is a lot of people have that face level idea of, like, policy advocacy stuff that's going on, because unfortunately we don't all have the time to like sit down and like comb through legislation and be able to understand because it's not really written in a digestible or accessible way, also very intentionally. So what are the things that people that maybe don't consider themselves to be quote unquote smart enough or an expert enough in policy or systemic change, or maybe they just don't know where to start in getting involved and making sure that they're able to keep up with these things because it is like a doom pod of things online where it's hard to see what's true, what's not. It can be very overwhelming to dive into policy or to just even be able to stay informed. Do you have like advice, tips, action items for people to kind of find out about policy in that digestible and accessible way?
This is a really great question and a good transition into what people can actually do. And one of the first things is that It's Miriam Kaba says that hope is a practice, hope is a discipline, right? And that's one big thing is we can't be losing hope. And that doesn't mean just like blindly go around hoping. It means like really lean in, find places where you see hope and lean into them. And then my other thing is to go from your strengths and to pick something and stick with it. Right now, there are so many issues across the country, across the world, within our communities. Even if I stayed only in DC, I'm in DC. Even if I stayed only in DC, I could not get involved in every single issue and every single
Yeah.
thing that's being debated by the city and all of that stuff because there are so many things from right the parks to how waste is managed to the wages for federal to not federal for the city employees like all of that stuff. There are so many different things to the schools, right? And so I typically tell people to either pick an issue and stick with that issue and figure out and learn all of the different mechanisms that can help
Mm.
with that issue. So if you pick environmentalism, policy can help with that. And within policy, the things that can help with that is increasing recycling, increasing the use of, I mean, honestly, increasing recycling probably won't do much. It's not doing much these days. But a different one is like increasing more sustainable practices, right? Increasing solar energy and the use of solar energy. That might come down to permits. Basically, find one or two things, right? One or two mechanisms within that issue
Mm.
that you're going to focus on. Maybe it's not policy. Maybe you focus on community gardens. Maybe you focus on helping
Yeah.
your local watershed by cleaning up the park. It doesn't have to be policy. It can be, but basically really focus on one or two mechanisms for the issue that you have chosen, or focus on you know finding one or two policies for that. Now that can be quite difficult because once again, legislation is written very inaccessibly. It's very difficult for everyday people to
Mm.
understand. So either find some organizations where you trust and get to know people and you trust that their staff, right, that they're usually their lawyer has reviewed this and
Yeah.
says, okay, no, I really do trust this. Or start trying to read it yourself. One of the big things I'm going to say, don't put it into AI and ask it to summarize it. They're often very, very wrong,
Please.
especially with the legal stuff. Like I have had somebody come back to me and say, that this bill we were supporting had criminalization in it, and it literally nowhere in it had any bit of criminalization. And I was like, where did you get that from? And they were like, oh, the ChatGPT summary said that it was criminalizing XYZ. And I was like, it so far from
Awesome.
that. It was not at all related to that. It was funding for prevention programming. It had no criminal or civil, legal. It had none of that in it. So it just like don't do that. But find some orgs, find some topics, and then find some ways that you can get maybe involved in that. And that might be going to the state house. That might be writing letters. That might be doing other things, and then let it go from there. But my biggest thing in this is to say to pick one or two things and then stick with it. Not every topic, and then free yourself from feeling the need to be hyper
Mm.
aware of and involved in every single thing. There are so many topics, and I'm not saying we should ignore what's happening around the country and around the globe. We need to be aware of these things, but we can only take action on so many. And I think right now, most people are kind of stuck in this loop where they're like, oh my God, there's so many things happening, right? There's multiple genocides happening
Yeah.
in the world right now. There's people in this country who are very poor. There's major healthcare issues. There's all these other issues, right? And then they're not taking any action because they're so busy trying to keep up on all of the issues
Yeah.
and just kind of doom scrolling. And so instead, pick one or two that preferably that you have lived experience with, one or two things where you're like, yeah, I've
Yeah.
experienced this personally. I have a very personal connection to this. And then go from there. Once again, look into it, find one or two mechanisms. Don't just pick, okay, I'm going to focus on healthcare and then I'm going to do all the healthcare advocacy because that's still too big.
Mhm.
It's still too big
Yeah.
to do all of that. The SVPA has to turn stuff down all the time where people are like, can you help us with this bill? And it's a sexual violence related bill that's good, that we agree with morally, that our values are behind, but we just don't have capacity. And if we go beyond
Yeah.
capacity, we actually won't get anything done. So pick one or two things, get really deep into them. If you can find a few orgs where you really trust the people, I would highly recommend that because having a lawyer who can review legislation is very, very important to understand what it
Yeah.
is saying and what its impact will be once passed.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, and I need to remind myself of all of that all of the time, I think, because I am one of those people, like, there's so much going on everywhere all the time, and I care about all of it, and it's so overwhelming to feel all those feelings all of the time. So, I appreciate that reminder. I will play that on playback for myself. But the last thing I wanted to ask you, and it's kind of multiple things in one question, so sorry about that. But if you could leave listeners with, like, one thing to remember from this conversation and or if you have any, like, action items specific to your work in the SVPA, that you wanna, like, send people on to? Because I think this conversation will, like, fire people up and encourage them to wanna do something. So if there's maybe one thing you wanna leave people with, and then an action item, whether
Yeah, absolutely. If I can leave people with one thing, it's simply that it's like kind of a two-parter. So I guess I'm breaking your rule and doing two things. But it's that
you're
sexual
fine.
violence is systemic. We need to understand that it's systemic. We need to understand the role that the government plays, that broad institutions play. It is absolutely systemic, and that requires systemic action, including the government perpetrating it directly. And then the second kind of piece being there that there are ways to take action. Individual people can take action on the systemic level. Getting plugged in and learning how can be complicated, but it's worth it. It's worth the patience it takes, and it's worth the community that you build in order to do that. That would be my biggest thing for people to kind of take away. And then the things to plug would just be one, if people can donate, please do. We have had a lot of funding cuts in relation to our criticism of the current administration, as well as our support of Palestine and trans people and immigrants, and all of that has resulted in, of course, some pretty massive funding cuts for us as an org. And also, when people in the community donate, we are responsible to those people, right? Because they donated and they
Mm,
say, we want right survivor centered advocacy and all of those things, and we want to hold truth to power. We want to criticize the government for what they're doing, all of that stuff that requires funding from smaller level people, but we can't get
yeah.
funding from the government themselves to then use to criticize the government. They don't like that.
Yeah. They don't
They
like
have made
that.
sure that we will not get any funding from them. And same with a lot of these bigger foundations, right? They're like, we're not going to give you money to go do something that gets us in trouble. And so,
Right, no
we're
controversial takes.
exactly. So we are entirely funded by small, low-level donors. So like anything, like literally $5 would make a very big difference. If you can donate, please do. And then the other thing is you can follow us on social media. We are SVPA official. So that's SVPA official on all accounts everywhere. We're most active, I would say, on Instagram and LinkedIn, actually. Our LinkedIn has been kind of blowing up since
Okay.
Twitter became whatever it is now. Yeah, it's actually our biggest social media now. We never saw this
Kinda
coming.
weird, but I like it.
Yeah, it's fine. We put our newsletter on there as well. You can also sign up for our newsletter on our website. We send it out once every 2 weeks, unless we do a lot of really big things, and then it's once every week. And typically, it's us just reporting what we've done. Like we don't use it to fundraise. We don't spam people. I promise. We don't sell anything. We just use it to say, here's what we've done, or here's what we're doing, and often an action item of here's how you can get involved. Right? If you can use our form to contact your elected official to tell them no more funding for ICE because of the mass sexual violence they're
Yeah,
committing. Right? Stuff like that is very helpful for us. And most of the action items, like I think all of the action items take less than 5 minutes. So if you're looking for ways to get involved,
yeah.
it'd be to follow us on social media and or our newsletter or both. And then once again, if you can donate to allow us to keep doing what we're doing and being quite controversial as an org, that would be awesome. But yeah, I think that's everything I had.
Beautiful, and I'll link, like, all of your social media and your website and everything, like, in our little description on the podcast. I will say you guys always post things in such a accessible and digestible way. Every time you send out, like, an action alert, like you said, it takes less than 5 minutes, so for anyone listening who's maybe looking for an easy way to get involved and stay informed in things in this sector, 10 out of 10 recommend SVPA, their newsletter, their social media, and definitely donating if you can because Omni and the SVPA, they do fantastic work, and I would love to see you for around forever until you don't wanna do it anymore.
Oh, thank you. I
Thank you so
appreciate
much for
that.
coming on.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really glad that you made this podcast, and I just think it's super important to talk about these things. And yeah, I'm so glad that this is something that you've taken on and that you're doing. And you have such a professional setup. I'm so impressed. This is awesome.
Thank you. I will see you guys next time.